On behalf of the English Department of Gaurmohan Shochin Mondol Mahavidyalaya, I wish everyone a good evening and extend a warm welcome to you all. Today, we present to you the second in our series of online lectures. Professor Chaitali Maitra will be delivering a lecture providing an overview of American literature. This has been primarily planned keeping in mind the undergraduate syllabus of Calcutta University, which has a core course on American literature. And we have often found our students grappling with the alien context and trajectory of this body of literature, far removed as it is from its British counterpart. Now, although American literature has a rather short history compared with the European literary tradition, nevertheless, it captures the spirit of the American nation. The American cultural identity and civilization are both transcribed in the body of literature that it has produced. It is marked by a certain plurality, a continued inventing of communities, and the sustained imagining of nations. This intertwining of American history, culture, and literature is best summed up in the words of the great Emerson, who said, America is a poem in our eyes. Its ample geography dazzles the imagination, and it will not wait long for meters. There is also an attempt and an aspiration to transcend its own borders. As Christopher Dawson put it has always aspired to be the literature not only of a new continent, but of a new world. I would like to begin today's event by requesting the bursar and acting teacher in charge of our college, Dr. Taposh Kumar Pal, to speak a few words.
Thank you, Anupama Madam. Honorable President Sir of Gaurmohan Shochin Mondol Mahavidyalaya, Sri Joydev Haldar, Principal Sir Dr. Abdullah Jamadar Hassan, Governing Body members, respected resource person, all the teachers of ours and other colleges, my dear students and other participants, good afternoon to all. I am pleased to welcome all of you in the webinar hosted by the Department of English of this college, in association with IQAC on the topic American Literature and Overview. The history of American literature stretches across more than 400 years. It can be divided into 5 major periods, each of which has unique characteristics, notable authors, and representative works. In its earliest days, during the 16th centuries, American literature consisted mostly of practical non-fiction written by British settlers who populated the colonies that would become the United States. A new era began when the United States declared its independence in 1776, and mass new writing addressed the country's future. American poetry and fiction were largely modeled on what was being published overseas in Great Britain, and much of what American readers consumed also came from Great Britain. By the first decades of the 19th century, a truly American literature began to emerge, though still derived from British literacy tradition. The short stories, novels published from 18th century through the 1820s began to depict American society and explore the American landscape in an unprecedented manner. In New England, several different groups of writers and thinkers emerged after 1830, each exploring the experiences of individuals in different segments of American society. Early 19th century literature, after the American Revolution, and increasingly after the War of 1812, American writers were exhorted to produce a literature that was truly native. Important movements in drama, poetry, fiction, and criticism took shape in the years before, during, and after World War I. The eventful period that followed the war left its imprint upon the books of all kinds. American literature is very important for the evolution of people, as it reveals the culture and history of the United States. Moreover, American literature studying in India gives us the opportunity to get to know American culture, history, and great works of the great authors better. We are very lucky to have an eminent speaker with us today. I would like to express my most sincere gratitude to Srimati Chaitali Maitra, Department of English, St. Paul's Cathedral Mission College, Kolkata. I must thank to all the faculties of the Department of English, headed by Professor Anupama Maitra, and also to other faculties, Professor Piyali Das, Devajyoti Das, Momita Purkait, and Sruba Jana. I also thank to the IQAC coordinator, Professor Ranjini Go, for arranging such an informative webinar. I wish this webinar may be a very fruitful and productive webinar. Thank you all. Over to Anupama Maitra.
Thank you very much, Taposh. I would now like to request our IQAC coordinator, Ranjini Guho, to speak a few words.
Good afternoon and a very warm welcome on behalf of the Internal Quality Assurance Cell, Gourmont Soshimandal Mahavidyalaya, to our esteemed and most loved speaker, Professor Chaitali Maitra. We are very happy to have you, Professor Maitra, again with us. Once you were there in our college for an invited lecture, we are very lucky to have you again. A warm welcome to all the participants, my students and my dear colleagues. This is a series of invited lectures which the English department has been doing from the past 1 month, and this I feel is a very good format to connect with the students, to connect with the researchers, one lecture per webinar, and I think this is a very good concept. My congratulations to the Department of English for organizing this. And American literature, I do not know much about American literature, but yes, American history being a special paper of mine, we have often seen reflections of American history right from the Revolution to the Reconstruction phase to the Great Depression. Many reflections of the American history in American mainstream literature, and we were often asked to read those books. And American literature, though, has a short history, but I think it is much varied in scope. And I wish the best to the webinar and also the best to the department. Thank you.
I will now request Professor Piyali Das of the Department of English to introduce our speaker for the day.
Thank you, Anupamadi, and good afternoon, everyone. Today we have with us the esteemed, eloquent, and elegant Professor Chaitali Maitra for our invited lecture series. I am honored to introduce our respected speaker with a brief bio note, though there is a lot to tell about her. Professor Maitra has been associated with undergraduate and postgraduate. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. Thank you. I'm honored to introduce our respected speaker with a brief bio note, though there is a lot to tell about her. Professor Maitra has been associated with undergraduate and postgraduate teaching for nearly 28 years now. She has been associated with prestigious institutions like St. Paul's Cathedral Mission College, Bethune College, Lady Brabourne College, and also Presidency University. At present, she is a guest lecturer in St. Paul's Cathedral Mission College, Bethune College, and Sanskrit University. She has edited a book on American poetry and has published many articles on American literature. Her area of interest is 19th century American travel literature. Today she is going to enlighten us by giving us an overview of American literature. We are eager to listen to her and welcome her on this virtual platform. Over to Professor Maitra for her deliberation.
Thank you, Professor Piyali, for that very, very generous introduction. And good evening to one and all. A big thank you for giving me the privilege of being able to come to this session and interact with everybody who would be involved. So Professor Anupama Maitra called me one of these days and she told me that if I could give an overview of American literature. And of course, I recoiled in fear because, as you can understand, that word overview can be quite similar to quicksands because it's quite a challenge to understand the literature of a particular nation, although it does not traverse many, many centuries like the other nations. So I did start thinking, and as I come to you all, before I go into any proper context, just let us agree upon a few things. I would be mostly addressing the students. So remember, when you think of the overview of a literature of any particular nation, there should be three important elements that must remain in your mind. First, the most important one would be the people. You can't have literature without people. So who were the people who lived in America, who wrote whatever they wrote, and we call it literature? Is any writing to be considered literature? That is the first point you should keep in mind. You're trying to understand how a nation is trying to create her identity with literature. So after the people, the most important point should be the geospatial component of a country. I have given you a rather technical word. Let me make it easier. What I mean basically is the geography of a country. But the word geography in today's times will no longer be relevant because with every geography of a nation, you need a lot of locational information. That's why I'm using the expression geospatial data. So every country will have a different geospatial data. That's why that also becomes important. In other words, if you think of America, the America into which the Puritans went and the America which is being governed in the present day do not have the same geospatial coordinates. That's why this would also be an important point when you think of the emergence of American literature. And the third important point is, of course, a very known one, the universal timeline. You have to respect the timeline of any nation to understand how its literature came into being, how it developed, what sort of changes came into it, how it is still developing. Most literature you can't say a last word on how a literature of a nation ends. We shouldn't be thinking of ends. We should be thinking of developments, changes, and how dimensions gradually improve or they address different issues. Okay? So keeping these 3 points in mind, we can begin with a particular sense of time. And for argument's sake, to establish our point, let us have a few words on pre-Columbian America, because America, as most of us know, would be that particular nation which started flowering after it was colonized by the British and the other European powers. But what existed before that? Did anything exist? We know that in the year 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered America. That is a quiz question answered. But before that, who would be staying there? Why is this discovery important? Should we at all call it discovery? Ask yourself these questions. It is discovery to the people who would be in Europe and to all of us. But it was not discovery for people who were already living there. So amongst the people who were living there, the pre-Columbian Native Americans, there is no reason to think that they were less advanced than the people who colonized them. Have that clear in your mind. Because if you look at the history of these people, let me name just a few. There were many, 120 native tribes, at least more. But just two names, the Maya civilization and the Aztecs could be named. You just should have to remember that these people who were already living in the geographical boundary which Columbus calls America, or we all establish as America were industrious enough, were hardworking enough to give rise to lots of positive ideas and were able to identify themselves with nature. Looking at their perspectives of nature, quite a few other things creeped into the being of the America which we are going to understand. Okay, so they were there, and Christopher Columbus coming to America as a foreigner started a fresh chapter. Now, we would have to take care of a few dates, but I would request you all, don't get your heads muddled up only with dates. Try to understand the changes that came over. You can find all the dates in your wiki, much, much better illustrated that I'm going to do for you. So 1492 then is the point where we start talking. Soon after this, within 5 years, 1497, an Englishman called John Cabot again was able to land to America and establish another place called Newfoundland. Around these times, these decades, maybe more than a century, I'll soon tell you the dates. What I'm trying to establish is that the names Columbus and John Cabot are just two among many, many who tried to cross the Atlantic and vie for the American soil. In other words, most European powers and the British tried to cross the Atlantic and explore and make the most of this massive land, which they called virgin land. Okay, we can't enter into every debate. We have to take a timeline and keep sort of proceeding. So from, say, 1497 to roughly 1607, more than a century, you find till in 1607, another Englishman called John Smith established what we call Virginia today. Why Virginia? Because he wanted to respect the Virgin Queen Elizabeth I. So from this point onwards, we could argue that although the other powers were trying their best to come and establish and sort of make their flag fly flatters in the American soil, it so happened that amongst all these names, quite a few names can be given. You can think of Magellan, Francis Drake, Babo, the Spanish explorer, Amerigo Vespucci from Florence, many other names, all explorers, they come, but amongst all of them, we find that a group of people who were definitely more focused on coming to the American soil left England in 3 ships. This would be the year 1620. So to place American literature in the context, 1620 is a good suggestion because it is this year, in this year, that 3 ships sailed from Plymouth, and one of the ships, let me talk about just one ship because it has a direct bearing with American literature. It was called Mayflower. In this particular ship, there were specific number of priests, specific number of women, specific number of children, and of course, gentlemen. There are still records which tell us about how many people were exactly there. So they started their journey across the Atlantic with enough food, water, with the hope of arriving to Virginia, because that was the known point for them. In the journey, however, there were difficulties and they knew about it. They knew that some of them might just not make it. They knew that in these times when the compass was still not in use, very, very primitive sailing conditions prevailed. They knew that many things might happen which might mar their chances of settling in America. Still, they began the journey, and as it happened, gradually we find we have the records of terrible storm overtaking them, and they could not land as they had planned in Virginia. So they landed in another place called Plymouth, and that's why this particular event is called the Plymouth Plantation, 1620. Why plantation? Because these people realized that the most important means of trying to control or trying to make their future flourish in an unknown region is to talk to the soil, is to get used to agriculture, is to know how the soil can be beneficial to them. If they are not able to do that, they will probably never be able to settle. And never being able to settle wouldn't mean that they could go back. It would mean they just perish forever. So when these people were trying their best to settle, two other names must also be mentioned. Two English names. One would be Sir Walter Raleigh and other would be Francis Drake, both English. Walter Raleigh is important because he was able to establish the Roanoke Islands, and this was done at the cost of quite a few deaths. I don't go into the details now. It's enough if I tell you that the Plymouth Plantation was the beginning of a much larger event called the Puritan Settlement. Just now you heard that the Puritan Settlement was the first phase of the birth of American literature. So why Puritan Settlement? Who were the Puritans? They were religious worshippers, Christians who wanted to defect from the Church of England, and they wanted, because they could not have enough freedom to practice religion the way they wanted, they decided to leave their home and come and find religious freedom together with that freedoms of other sorts in an unknown zone. So America, right from the beginning, has provided enough for the people who were unknown to her. She was so full of possibilities, so virgin, so massive, that people who tried to come to her and find settlement had to find the means. It was never a final difficulty to find this settlement. So this is how the Plymouth colony was established, and as soon as this was done, these people were very, very focused, and they started doing their harvesting and growing crops. Gradually, an year passed, and after a year, when they were able to bring their harvest home, and they were happy to see that they were able to grow so much, basically they were religious people. They planned to thank God. And from this time onwards, you would have Thanksgiving Day included in the American calendar, which is usually the last Thursday of the November. So the whole point behind the Thanksgiving Day is a very, very practical attitude of thanking nature. That means putting your harvest together. Think of us Bengalis, the Nabanno festival. You will find what we do is we bring in the best of our harvest together and try to share it amongst us. This sharing has a sense of thanks, has a sense of giving, has a sense of, shall I say, complete appreciation of what we can do and what nature has given us. This is how American literature began. It did not begin with a pen and a piece of paper. It did not begin with a mic. It did not begin with a press which was constructed. It began with man trying to feel for man, with religion in the background. Okay? So here then, when the people who were coming to the colony and they were facing a terrible storm, they realized that unless they agree to do things together or to obey a few amongst, say, 100, they will fall into trouble. So what did they do? They all got together and they tried to put a few things in writing, which tried to say the text of that writing was that A, B, C, D, E would be done, E, F, G, H, I would not be done. So it was one form of a very basic, crude writing, which tried to establish that in order to stay in a group, some form of obedience was needed. This writing is called the Mayflower Compact. And the Mayflower Compact is usually treated as one of the most rudimentary forms of democracy that America will have. Okay? You will find that this entire Mayflower Compact and the times after this, you would find the priests taking a very, very important role. I would just like to connect to you all the importance of the priests as it would be in England. Think of your English literature, history of English literature. Who would be the priests? People who would get specially trained in the old universities, particularly Oxford, Cambridge, York. So just reminding you that these priests that we are talking about were also specifically educated people, and some names are important. I will be telling you some names. One important name is Cotton Mather, Jonathan Edwards, and Roger Williams. So let me repeat the names: Cotton Mather, Jonathan Edwards, and Roger Williams. So obviously, these three names are important for you, but what is more important is understanding the fact that these three priests wrote specific books which are usually classed to be bits of American literature, the early bits. Okay, for instance, Roger Williams wrote the Bloudy, B-L-O-U-D-Y, meaning bloody, Bloudy Tenets of Christianity. Okay, the spelling was different because if you remember your Elizabethan texts, spellings were different at that point as well. H-O-V, V was written, it was U, but it was written in the form of V. I'm sure you all remember that. So similarly, that is how these writings started. So once the Mayflower Compact was signed, and with that particular piece of writing, these people landed. That was the beginning of what they did. And for the next few decades, almost a century, from 1620, it goes on, not really a century, less than a century, these people were happy to harvest, happy to do things for the community, and gradually the community increased. With the increase of community, they had to tier power. They had to give a certain sense of responsibility to a certain group of people, and so on. But what happened was that they were being taxed by the British king. And a time came when this taxation could no longer sort of be accepted by these people. And they decided the 13 colonies which were formed. They look up when you have a minute, you will find there were 13 colonies altogether. After the Stamp Act, a series of taxation acts, and Townshend Act were established by the British Parliament, the 13 colonies revolted. Why? Because they wanted to be independent from whom? From the British king. Why? Because they were growing their harvest, they were growing their crops, they were taking care of everything that you need to do, and yet they had to pay a lot of tax. Amongst these difficult reigns that I sort of said, the Stamp Act and the Townshend Act, in one of these years, specifically in 1773, something happened which some of you may have heard of. The Boston Tea Party happened at this year. What was the Boston Tea Party? Boston, as you know, is in Massachusetts. It has been the center of culture in the American history right from the time of inception. And close to Boston, there is a big harbor. And as it happened, the big chests of tea which was supposed to be sold to the local people, they were thrown to the sea as a mark of protest. What sort of protest? Because the tea that was supposed to be bought by the common people had to be paid a lot more, which would facilitate revenue for the British king. It wouldn't help the local people in any way. As a result, this happened after 1773. From 1775, a war started. And what happens in a war, tell me? After any famous war, famous literature has been born. So from 1775, for the next almost 8 years, 1783, the American War of Independence, also known as the American Revolution, started. And although the war was finally it came to an end in 1783, we are more concerned with the year 1776. Why? Because it is in this year that the Declaration of Independence was signed in Pennsylvania. You can find out more about the Declaration of Independence. We are concerned with the importance of the Declaration of Independence signed in 1776 because after this, the United States of America was born. It came into being, and this was the first republic in modern history. So once this was established, obviously quite a few changes would come, and the most important names that must be in your mind at this stage of American history, names whose works would enter into literature. One would be Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was a polymath, politician, particularly celebrated personality in the American context. Benjamin Franklin wrote a famous book called The Autobiography, as you must be knowing, but he is more remembered by another book called Poor Richard's Almanac. Poor Richard's Almanac. What is unusual about Poor Richard's Almanac? Who is Poor Richard? He is just an imaginary character. Why is this almanac important? Because through the mouth of Poor Richard, Benjamin Franklin was able to establish certain good habits which would form characters for the American people. You must be knowing these things. Suppose, look at this saying, early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. That was a saying of Poor Richard. Okay. Also, too many cooks spoil the broth. That was also found in the almanac. So the almanac, as you must be knowing, is not really a storybook, but it is a written document of how people could focus their energies and make the best of whatever they have. That is why the almanac is important. Apart from the almanac, another important written work was also born during these times. That is the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers is considered to be the first important text of American literature. Federalist Papers were published for 2 consecutive years, 1787 and 1788. What sort of things would this be? What are the Federalist Papers? Nothing else but a series of essays written by the most important statesman and politician of America of these times. They were influenced by another very important name called Thomas Paine, who wrote a famous book, many books, but the one in context is called The Common Sense. And this book, The Common Sense, was a strong influence for the writers who formulated the essays which constitute the Federalist Papers. Many names can be cited, particularly Alexander Hamilton, John Jay. These are more important names. But what you need to take away from this is that, remember, the Federalist Papers, once you go home today and look at the wiki, you will find the author is Publius. Publius is a Roman name, which means the people who wrote the Federalist Papers did not want their name to be there, because they were trying to create one form of constitution that would ensure individuality, liberty, social justice, and all the higher attributes that a nation must be conscious of in order to take the next steps in future. So the Federalist Papers should be considered as one of the initial important works of American literature. Okay? So we go to the next century. Look at the date 1783. Around the turn of the 18th century, or throughout 18th century, you would find quite a few important things happening. And this era, after the Puritan Settlement, this era is generally called the Enlightenment Era. What does this mean? Tell me. What do you think when you think of the word enlightenment? You think of more light, which means you presuppose darkness. You must keep in mind that America as a nation was becoming more and more informed during these times. Most people tried to help in doing things which would establish America's identity as a more advanced country than it was. So during the times of the Puritan settlement, you will find darkness or lack of light to be important. There wouldn't be much electric lights, so people would have to light up fireplaces. And this darkness, where you do not see things clearly, gives rise to the famous play called The Crucible by Arthur Miller. You read another play in your syllabus, but it's just for you to remember that this darkness was gradually being conquered, and America was having more and more lights, both in the verbal sense as well as in the metaphorical sense. So more was happening to America all throughout the 18th century, and that is, this Enlightenment era was definitely more respectful of rationality than tradition. So I wouldn't ask you to throw away the word tradition. That is not what you feel if you look at the city lights of Virginia or Pennsylvania or even Boston. But it is important for you to remember that rationality or anything that is practical was more important, was sort of more easily embraced by the American mind. The importance of representative government coming from Mayflower Compact, getting solidified in the Federalist Papers, getting further sort of solidified by the Almanac, the autobiography, Thomas Paine's Common Sense. All these books should be treated as events, phenomenon, which shape up the American mind, and you find that representative government actually meant more and more hard work for the common man. Everybody tried to become someone who could represent something better. So this is how liberty, equality, and justice was prioritized. So obviously you have, by this time, literature was quite very much crystallized, and among the poets of these times, the most important name would be Philip Freneau. Freneau's poems flourished in these years. Among the novelists, you have the names of James Fenimore Cooper and Charles Brockden Brown and Washington Irving. I'm sure some of you might remember Rip Van Winkle, written by Washington Irving. What do we have as common for all these novelists? Remember, they were trying to look at the American landscape and place their characters against this utopian dimension of American landscape. That is how characters were formed. For instance, you would find the character called Nutty Bumppo by Cooper. You will find that all his characters, the characters which you find in the novel called The Last of the Mohicans, The Deer Slayer, are all characters who have a lot of physical grit and determination to conquer the immediate hurdles to establish a relatively better life. I have said relatively, which means it's not the idea of the maximum happiness. It is just the idea of getting better than what you have. So that particular grit was one important factor which would create American individuality, because that is on that American nation is going to thrive. What is individuality? It is something that one single human being would do given a set of circumstances. In other words, if there are 10 of you, and if 10 of you face the same problem, not all 10 of you will react in the similar manner. You will find that your reaction is at least 9 types out of 10. That is individuality, where each human being reacts in a different way under a given set of circumstances. Apart from these novelists, I must mention a very early novel of America, which is called The Power of Sympathy. The Power of Sympathy was published in the same year as the French Revolution, is labeled 1789. This was written by William Hills Brown. The Power of Sympathy is important. I feel like mentioning it separately because here in this novel, you see that a brother and a sister, unknown to themselves, fall in love, and how the aftermath sort of comes. I've been trying to talk about American individuality. So this type of novels were published. So imagine the guts of the American novelists. They were published as early as 1789. Earlier than that, there was another novel also called Adventures of Alonso. This was written by Digges, Thomas Digges. You don't have to remember the name or the author, but you need to remember the point that even this novel, Adventures of Alonso, the title is apparently simple, but the adventures that this character undergoes is also a series of trying circumstances. So this individual falling into difficulty and trying to make the most of a series of difficulties is almost a general theme of American writings. So back to Brockden Brown, Washington Irving, and James Fenimore Cooper, you also have the presence of women writers. But let me clarify. When I say women writers, I do not mean the waves of feminism. Okay, that comes later. I just mean that because America was a place for individuals to thrive, women were also allowed to write. There was nobody trying to stop them. Okay? Among the famous names of this era would be Anne Bradstreet, the poet Anne Bradstreet. She did have a very, very strong English background, a very high-lifted elite background, which helped in her poetry writing. But the life she lived was not the life of an elite. She lived a struggling life in the American soil. And it is from there she wrote her famous poems. Okay. Apart from Anne Bradstreet, you have single women doing unusual things. So one Anne Bradstreet, one Sarah Campbell Knight. Sarah Campbell Knight undertook a sort of adventurous travel being a woman, and her travel memoir is treated as a sort of important bit of American literature. You have one Hannah Foster. Hannah Foster was also a very, very sort of, shall I say, adventurous lady. And she wrote a novel called The Coquette. But she published it anonymously because she was in two minds as to whether her novel would really see the publisher's face or come out in print. But later on, it became a famous novel. So the effort of a woman was already to be seen, not to be mixed up with the generality of women writing. Okay. You also have another important name, whose name I must sort of say, the name of Judith Sargent Murray. Judith Sargent Murray's name is important because after living a life which is full of challenges. She has written quite a few sort of stories, essays, letters, and so on. But she also wrote a famous essay called On the Equality of Sexes. Okay, so this essay is one important landmark which tries to establish that the women and the men should be given equal footage. Okay, so with these important names traversing throughout the 18th century, 100 years, a bunch of 100 years are gone. We come to the 19th century. So when you come to the 19th century, the background of Enlightenment code was already there, spelt out in capital letters. Now, American individualism would establish itself more powerfully. And you will find everywhere any dictatorial measures would be challenged, would be resisted. And because no dictatorial measures were encouraged, this led to certain changes in the American society, giving birth to literature of different sorts. I think it is sensible, it would be sensible for you all to keep in mind, if you think of one particular flower with whorls round it, you will find all these whorls make that flower. So if you look, if you sort of write the statement like this, that resistance was always encouraged to any dictatorial measures, so you put a therefore. Therefore, abolitionism or writings which wanted to abolish slavery altogether came into being. Therefore, women's writing got better represented. Therefore, journalism was given more importance. Therefore, more and more magazines were born. So among all these therefores, you will find bags and bags of literature happening. Look at abolition. With abolition, you associate what? You associate torture, slavery, and you have a big body of writings which would be the slave narratives. They form an important part of American literature. We cannot deny that many writings which you find written by both men and women, among the women, the name that springs to my mind is Nancy Prince. She wrote her travel sort of memoirs, which would be actually a slave narrative. Most people tried to find a better life. With the establishment of this representative government, and due to all this, more and more fanning for abolitionism could happen. If you look at the women's writings getting represented, in the middle of the 19th century, around 1850, 1848 to be precise, there was an important conference which happened called the Seneca Falls Convention. And in the Seneca Falls Convention, you find the women coming together, headed by many, among many, Lucretia Mott is a name, you can find out. Women were coming to this conference to find a better representation of whatever they are doing, not just writing literature, mind you, trying to do things together which would give them a better financial standing, sewing, cooking, trying to help the people who wanted education. All sorts of work was encouraged so that they could earn something. This also resulted in another body of women's writings which form an important part of American literature. We come to journalism. I was talking about journalism. You will find that most of your syllabus authors, most of your syllabus authors tried their luck first in the magazines and journals of their times. Today in Star Mark or in Amazon, you find their books and they are priced. That is not how they began. They had to suffer a lot and they had to make their names appear in print with the help of these journals and magazines. I must also say in this context that with these journals and magazines, life on the whole was becoming more and more comfortable. You would find another type of books which were being sort of issued. They were called pictorial encyclopedias. As you can understand, what is the meaning of Pictorial Encyclopedia? A book of pictures, but not just pictures itself, little notes given on them, which would inform the people in a casual way. And in some of these pictorial encyclopedias, it first happened, let me tell you, that a theater hall was shown in a picture. Underneath that picture, it was written theater hall. But actually, it was not a theater hall. It was just the inside of a big community hall. But in this hall, a theater could be staged. So this makes me say that this is how American drama began. You will not have the same cultural foundation that you associate with English drama in the American context. And if you look at the American drama context, you will find that it would be quite sort of natural, quite evident that this is how drama began. And if you go take the names of the famous American dramatists, the first would be, at least before Eugene O'Neill, the name that comes to my mind is George Kelly. Following late 19th century, George Kelly, around 1887. Okay. George Kelly, followed by Eugene O'Neill, followed by Maxwell Anderson, followed by Archibald MacLeish. Archibald MacLeish is going to come into our discussion after a while. And then Clifford Odets, Tennessee Williams, then Arthur Miller, the dramatist whom you read, followed by a recent name, say for instance, Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote a play called A Raisin in the Sun. So if you look at the trajectory of the American playwrights, this is how it began. And looking at the importance that the pictorial encyclopedias were able to sort of furnish, we cannot deny that all types of journalism, magazine foundation, pictorial encyclopedias actually created more and more space for American literature to flourish. All types of American literature, plays, poems, short stories, essays, sketches, novels, all types of literature would be found in these magazines. We need to talk about certain aspects of 19th century literature. Let us turn to Romanticism. You all know that Romanticism, the inception of Romanticism was in Germany, but after going through England and France, the same waves of Romanticism came to America around 1820. And this laid the ground for the most important ism that happened in 19th century in America. This is called Transcendentalism. And Transcendentalism, what was Transcendentalism? It was a philosophical movement which happened in the 19th century America. It was initiated, names associated would be Emerson and Thoreau. But apart from Emerson and Thoreau, there would be quite a few other names: Bronson Alcott, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Margaret Fuller, and quite a few other names who all tried to contribute to the idea that man must be appreciated as someone who has a sense of unity with the nature and God, whoever the God is. Just a reminder that God in America was not just the Christian God. Because if you look at the American travel writings of the 19th century, you would find many religious factions coming into being. For instance, the Mormons. They were not Christians, but they were also incorporated in the entire oeuvre of America and her writings. So obviously, when I say that the transcendentalist philosophers were intently trying to find a string of unity between human beings, anything that is elemental, and God, they were just not looking for a Mr. God. They were looking for a concept, largely abstract, but could be addressed in terms of man. As a result, the writers who cater to the transcendentalist codes would write in a similar manner. So who were the writers? The most known writers, and the writers who you would always read even after you pass your exams, mostly Herman Melville, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Edgar Allan Poe. Of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Among the main ones, there would be many minor transcendentalist authors who would also sort of contribute to the entire body of American literature. So now look at how man's supremacy was being established over nature and God. So now think of 1850 and look at a few novels around 1850. Okay, don't worry too much about the date of each novel. Better to keep 1850 in mind. The four novels that I would like to sort of mention in this context would be Moby Dick by Herman Melville, where the central character, Captain Ahab, is trying to take a revenge over a whale who harmed his leg. As a result, Captain Ahab dies, but his death establishes the power of man, not the power of the whale. Okay. The second novel is called The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. In this novel, again, the same theme, the whole idea is the same, to establish the divinity of man. And this time the theme is adultery, sin. So what is sin? Is it a construct done by man? To what extent would God govern the lives of man? Where would rationality rest itself? Does all rationality end in happiness? No. And establishing this no is what Hawthorne tries to do. Okay. The third novel is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Again, the divinity in man. You should think of the character of Legree and find out the other side of divinity that is shown. Harriet Beecher Stowe. Finally, the fourth novel, The House of Usher. Fall of the House of Usher by Poe. Here again, the superiority of man, but the theme is different. What is the theme? Inheritance. So all these four novels which I have mentioned try to illustrate one particular perspective through which the superiority of man is established. What I haven't said about these four authors is that they were prolific authors, and it is with them in mind that we talk of American Renaissance. What is American Renaissance? American Renaissance is nothing else but a solidification of national unity. Okay? Because without this national unity, you wouldn't have anything which is particularly American in style. So from this point onwards, it is fair to call American literature exactly what it is, that is American literature, gradually freeing itself from the English counterpart. So it's important to keep in mind in this context that in the later half of the 19th century, among the other literary genres, short story saw a flourish. And all the authors whom I mentioned were also practitioners of great short story writers. Some wrote novellas, but the art of writing a condensed novel with the same intensity of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Moby Dick, or Scarlet Letter was a challenge, which these authors did face individually with great success. If you look at Hawthorne, the collection of Hawthorne stories is called Hawthorne and His Mosses. Okay, so you find many short stories of Hawthorne there. You would find this could be differentiated into categories like Poe's short stories. You are reading one of Poe's short stories, you will find that the short story Purloined Letter, which was published 1844, was a story which brings to the fore the presence of one single human being of unusually lifted up intelligence, Dupin. Okay, so Auguste Dupin, the detective of Poe, who you meet in the Purloined Letter, must make you think that by now, 1844, short story itself has become a genre. And not only short story means that you would address different themes. And gradually, in the American social life, the underworld is becoming more and more active. Remember, the 19th century was the century of expansion. It was the century of scientific discoveries. 1844 is the year when Purloined Letter was published. 1845 is the year when anesthesia was finally established in the American scenario in Massachusetts. You can read up about this in a famous book, in many books, but the book in my mind is called Man and Medicine, which tries to talk about the establishment of anesthesiology as a subject. Okay, so this idea of anesthesia also influenced Poe's mind. And among other aspects, he wrote a short story called The Cask of Amontillado, where anesthesia, or forgetting the senses, was used as the theme. Although the concept there was intoxication, but the whole point of forgetting consciousness was also a part of the theme of that particular story. So the whole idea of short story getting more and more qualified, more and more intense, was done in the later half of the 19th century. So just to sort of remind you that 1844 would be the inception of the detective coming in sort of body to you in form of Auguste Dupin, because soon, I mean, quite a few years after that, as late as 1887, you find Sherlock Holmes coming, and much later, 1920, Hercule Poirot. So the string of understanding a person who is able to rely more on his intuition, he's able to think backwards as it happens in Purloined Letter, all were new in American literature, which also sort of was able to influence some of the other places. Okay, so now after we come to the later half of the 19th century, the most important event must be mentioned, and the most important event, the political event of 19th century, would be the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, followed by the era of Reconstruction. So why the Civil War? Because there was a difference in opinion over the slavery issue. So the Civil War was fought between the north part of North America and the south part of North America. People make mistakes. It is not South America. It's a totally different context altogether. All is happening in North America. And in the year 1865, as you know, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Following this, you find the Civil War coming to an end, the slavery question definitely getting a lot of importance. The Abolition Act was passed in the British Parliament much before that, much before the Civil War. But although the Abolition Act was passed, the slavery issue was still a burning issue. If you remember your Huck Finn was published in 1885. And in the novel, Huck makes every effort to take his friend Jim to the place where he will no longer be captured as a slave. So the issue remains the same. And again, Huck has to take recourse to certain quote-unquote wrong activities in order to make his canoe go through the Mississippi River. So now then, once we come to the Reconstruction era, you will find that with the Reconstruction era, many other important things are also happening, because America is gradually, again, giving more and more importance to expansion. During this time, movement in America from the New York side to the San Francisco side found a sort of extra momentum. And in the year 1869, as you must be knowing, the Transcontinental Railway was established. So having a railway established which connects one side, connects from one coast to the other coast, they call it coast to coast railway, is one important gallop to reduce the concept of time. And once you reduce the concept of time, you will find literature is gaining ground in other ways, not just time. It's no longer enough to say that, as you see in Usher, that the father dies and the house sort of comes to being. That concept of time is lost forever. So with this insight, we have to sort of come to the change that you find in the realism that creeps into American literature. I must point out at this stage that American literature, I think, has more or less always been realistic. It has addressed the immediate, always, right from the Puritan times. Now, what happens is that this realism is getting, shall I say, stratified. And now there is a change in the moral perspectives, which resulted in realism of a different sort. Let me tell you the names. You can make your own judgments. The first name would be Charles Darwin. The influence of Charles Darwin, 1859, Origin of Species, was able to influence Marx, and was also, the next influence would be Nietzsche, where you see of the vision of the Superman. So realism was now just not what you see immediately. It was more than that. Okay. Now, again, as I said, in the last part, in the end of 19th century, you find something important happening to the frontier. What is the frontier? The frontier would be that particular space which the people of America, not necessarily born, America, as you know, is a land of immigrants. 19th century was the time when maximum immigrants come to America. They try to make their own living, livelihood, and so on by constantly going from east to west, from New York side to San Francisco side. And as they keep traversing, the frontier theory becomes more and more pronounced. This frontier theory was consolidated, was pointed out by the historian called Frederick Jackson Turner in his Frontier Thesis, 1893. And this thesis tries to establish that the frontier is also a part of American consciousness. When we talk about American individuality, we are just not talking about one human being or human beings. We are talking about the geography, as I said, the geospatial location that these human beings have to constantly conquer. Okay? With this constant conquering of the frontier, cities which span from New York to San Francisco got established. Important acts also came into being. American system of education improved. You find the language being given more importance. Think of the names of Noam Chomsky. And you also find the whole idea of addressing nature in American poetry getting different languages. Okay. I was, just let me go back to 1865 once more. I told you about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. What I haven't done is to relate one of your syllabus poems, "O Captain, My Captain," with this assassination. Walt Whitman, one of the most important poets of 19th century America, I should say America on the whole, wrote this poem to sort of make the country conscious of the loss of a captain. And in the text of your poem, you find the presence of the sea. Remember, most American literature I mean, many examples can be given. The sea becomes an important entity. Okay, so here in O Captain, My Captain, it's a lament. The poem is a lament because the need for a good leader is being sort of said in the poem. That is the context of the poem. Prior to this, I have been talking to you all about how Poe is addressing the concept of nature. And in one of his poems that you would be reading, Helen, you find how he looks at a woman, how he treats nature in the text, and how the importance of the poet gets pinpointed in the text of the poem, which deals with something else. That is what you should be remembering. And now we come to one of the very important years of the 19th century, which would be 1890. Why so important? Because it is in this year, under the presidentship of the 23rd president was Benjamin Harrison. Under his presidency, the frontier was closed. So as soon as the frontier was closed, what does this mean? It means that there wouldn't be any more permission for immigrants to go beyond this particular place. So the frontier could not be extended anymore. As soon as this happened, it was the close of 19th century. Think of 1890. Such important events cannot be pinpointed or understood just in terms of 1 year. You have to allow a decade. And by that decade, it is 20th century. Okay? So here you would find the end of American dream. So let me explain two important concepts which must be in your minds. One is the American dream. What is the American dream? You have that as a theme in Death of a Salesman. American dream is the whole concept of finding success, money, friend, family, steering the society, making the most of life by individual effort as well as collective effort. That is the American dream. And with the close of the frontier, the American dream had to come to an end, because if the immigrants could not pursue further, obviously the urban poor would increase in number. The idea of the urban poor was more American. In England, in the Victorian era, although the middle class expanded and the same problems were faced in England, the urban poor was more American in inception than English. As a result, you would find that again realism would have to find another language. So all American literature is one form of pursuing realism in different ways. So from this point onwards, if you look at the first 2 decades, say, of the 20th century, when the First World War comes into being, you would find the novels like Red Badge of Courage by Stephen Crane, novels like McTeague, all novels of Frank Norris, Theodore Dreiser, An American Tragedy. All these novels were sort of speaking of the difficulty that the common man would be facing due to lack of space, lack of, shall I say, advantages. And as a result, all novels of these times will show you the common man suffering. But suffering, common man suffering, is not common man losing out on life. Don't make a mistake. American literature never encourages losing out, failures. They look at failure from a new perspective. Okay? So here then you find something else happening to American literature. We need to sort of look at another aspect of these times. If you sort of remember, you will find that when you come to the realism aspect of these novels, there would also be more and more reason to find out one form of fragmentation which sort of permeates the literature of these times. Okay? you will find many isms coming in. We are talking of American literature, but should you look at American paintings, you would find in the 19th century, more and more specific paintings were done. Think of Audubon. He would be painting animals in great detail, but that great detailing will have to change, because now the whole idea of speed has to be addressed. As a result, cubist paintings, Dadaist paintings, Surrealist paintings come into being. The same happens in literature. You would find another, after the First World War, you would find that there is a bunch of American novelists who find that they do not have enough encouragement to pursue their ideals. And some of them, they leave America and they go to, they don't plan to do so, but it so happens that these bunch of writers, they are usually treated together, and they are called the lost generation novelists, and quite a few of them are sort of part of your syllabus. So I thought of having a word on them. So you would find the lost generation novelists mostly staying in and around Paris. They would be headed by Gertrude Stein, but they would also include F. Scott Fitzgerald, Archibald MacLeish, whom I mentioned while talking about the American drama, Ernest Hemingway, Old Man and the Sea is part of your syllabus, and also William Faulkner. So you have to read Dry September. Remember, all these novelists were trying to address the real problems of America in terms sometimes which are different. In Crack Up, for instance, the terms would be different. In Crack Up, you find how Fitzgerald is addressing the problems associated with fame. In Dry September, you find Faulkner trying to question the element of doubt and rumor in a particular society. He also makes it clear that usually we have certain knots in our mind, and there is a general tendency in the characters shown to think that a white lady can never lie. So all these twists which give rise to difficulty is being addressed here by Faulkner. Look at the middle of the 20th century. You will find other important aspects coming to the fore. Time is advancing, and you will quite a few things to be thought of here. If you look at the poem After Apple Picking, its publication date is 1914, just around the First World War around the corner. But the text of the poem is trying to look at the meaning of success. How important it is to succeed. How important is sleep? Does sleep become a symbol of rest? Or does sleep mean something else? Those are the questions that Robert Frost is going to ask. There would be a definite suggestion from my side to read the poem Birches and Mending Wall when you read After Apple Picking. You will find that somewhere After Apple Picking is one sort of, shall I say, introspection on how you look at whatever you have achieved in life. Even The Road Not Taken is a good poem in this context. You should read these poems by Robert Frost when you read After Apple Picking. We come to another, totally a different aspect of American literature, and that is the Harlem Renaissance. What is Harlem Renaissance? Harlem Renaissance was a sort of movement which is usually dated between 1919 to 1935, and the New Negro movement together with that. The whole idea, there were many people involved in this. One of the names should be important for you, Langston Hughes, but other very famous names, Claude McKay, they were also involved in this Harlem Renaissance. So why is this important for you? Alain Locke is another name. So why is this important for you? It is important for you because you would find that the whole idea of, once again, the individualism in America is finding expression in the poems of Langston Hughes. I say poems, what I mean is his entire writing, entire oeuvre of Langston Hughes. You would be reading one particular poem, Harlem, the montage of a dream deferred, that is your poem. I have decided to let you know that this poem is a sandwich poem between two other poems. Okay? And these two other small poems are quite known to the American people. I have made it a point to sort of read these two stanzas. It will take only a minute. I'll tell you how to place this poem. Okay. Good Morning Daddy, the poem that precedes your poem in the syllabus, is Good Morning Daddy, ain't you heard the boogie woogie ramble of the dream deferred? That is the first poem, just two stanzas. And then your poem, What Happens to a Dream Deferred? That is how it begins. And it ends with, Does it explode? That is the last line. Many stages are given, many symbols are given of the dream. It sags like a load. It's like a raisin in the sun. If you look at the text, many images are given. Finally, a question is asked where no images are there, only a suggestion of what can happen to a dream deferred. So after this middle portion, which is your text, comes another portion from which I read another stanza. Dream within a dream, our dream deferred. Good morning, Daddy, ain't you heard? Between two rivers, north of the park, like darker rivers, the streets are dark. Dream within a dream, our dream deferred. Good morning, Daddy, ain't you heard? So the flippance of these two poems which precede and follow the central poem, which is your text, helps this poem to become more and more pronounced. That is how you should read Langston Hughes. I would definitely ask you to read at least two or three other poems, particularly Mother by Langston Hughes. Okay, it would help you to understand what he means when he talks about dream deferred. Now, as we advance more and more, this is just one aspect of the 20th century life. As you must be knowing, this particular poem is supposed to be, it's called the Lenox Avenue Mural section. Lenox Avenue is the name of a road, like our Central Avenue. Okay, where is Lenox Avenue? But in a particular part from Manhattan to Harlem. Harlem is the part of New York where the Black people sort of concentrate in staying. There are many reasons as to why that is their specific place, but we agree that this part of New York remains a pocket where the Black population is more and more concentrated. So after this, we have to become a little more general because now, as you go, you sort of past 1950s, you would find, again, voices are becoming more and more muffled. By now, the feminist waves have happened. You are reading Daddy by Sylvia Plath. You will be going through the text, but you will be finding that the clash in the poem is between a self of the poet and the presence of an oppressive male. Okay? So the language of the poem, which does not contain itself towards the end, Daddy, Daddy, you bastard, I'm through, is one form of expressing the discontent of being dominated or overpowered in any relationship. Daddy is just a metaphor in any relationship. So that is Sylvia Plath's sort of stand. Now, as we go towards the end of the 20th century, we find that the individual again gets a bigger focus. And obviously the landscape, the country, the society, it's a sort of series of decimation that is happening. And throughout this process of decimation, you will find the scope of the individual is becoming more and more expanded. Okay, a time comes now in the mid 20th century where you find many plays which were being written. You read Death of a Salesman, but you should remember that this was also the time, right from Langston Hughes, where music and the jazz culture in America plays an important part. It promotes more and more movement. Okay, so the jazz culture is also important. Now, as we are almost about to round off our discussion, remember all these musicals have a sort of specific function to perform. You will find that when you look at the musicals and the apparent success that these musicals have, think of any of your favorite musicals, Phantom of the Opera or any other example, you will find more and more people gathering, more and more people making money, people who are performing. So it is no longer right to think of American literature in terms of what you see in print, because it is much more dimensional than that, much more complex than that. And as you find, again, the novels gradually sort of change. You find novels like, sort of say, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, Kurt Vonnegut's novels like Slaughterhouse-Five. Everywhere the individual is being crushed, and the effort of the writer is to find out the best of that crushed individuals. The same is true about Hemingway. You are reading Old Man and the Sea. I would request you all to look at Old Man and the Sea as a point of identification of American masculinity. Then you can think of Santiago and Manolin as two faces of American masculinity. Santiago's eyes were like the sea, as deep and blue as the sea. Manolin does not tell his parents that he is going to be friends with Santiago, and this is how their individualities develop. I told you about Huck Finn. I'm telling you about Manolin. They have certain similarities. The difference is the backdrop. They still illustrate that this is what masculinity means. Just a reminder, Huck Finn had stolen a few eggs, and he was wearing a girl's dress, and those eggs were sort of hidden in between his knees. When they fell down, he was caught, but he doesn't wait to be whipped, he runs away. So that is individuality. So once you think of individuality, it is important that you do not relate a sense of blame or wrong. You should look at the set of circumstances and then sort of appropriate the good or the bad of it. So finally, the more and more ethnic voices get together in American literature, and popular culture is also born. Now, once you think of popular culture, there is no end to talking on popular culture. It can go on. And you would find that in the American context, the philosopher William James and his pragmatism has got a lot of effort, a lot of priority, which again gets illustrated in many literatures. I will round off by saying that it's important for us to remember that this tenacious settler frontier theory actually changes the American face of the self, of the individual. And in order to, before ending, I must mention a particular book, which is not really a literature book, but it is a very important book which illustrates the multifacetedness, the dimension, and the resilience, the flexibility that the American mind has been able to achieve, the American individual has been able to achieve. This particular book is called The Law of the Heart. It is by Sam Girgus, Girgus. The full name of the book is The Law of the Heart, Individualism and the Modern Self in American Literature. My reason for selecting this book to conclude our discussion is simply this, that individualism still remains the key word in American literature. It is for us to look at each, shall I say, section of American literature. I'm saying section because development is a very, very slippery word. Whatever has developed has also given rise to many questions. So it's important for you to feel that this ongoing process is also one way of looking at the complete individual, able to take, understand, and cope with any challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chaitali. And I am reminded of a line from Jhumpa Lahiri's The Namesake, where she says, that's the thing with books. They let you travel without moving your feet. So, well, I'm reminded of a line in Jhumpa Lahiri in Namesake where she says that, that's the thing about books. They let you travel without moving your feet. So, we felt, I think I'm speaking for all the participants. I think we went on this, long literary journey through America, geospatial and all of that. So there have been a number of compliments for you and some questions. So I'll take the first question that had come in. It's by Preeta Chatterjee. And
well, the sea is not an important entity in all American poems, but the sea does come as one important factor, because if you look at again the geospatial coordinates, it is through the sea, especially the Atlantic side, that the inception of America happened. If you look at the Pacific side and if you go upwards towards the Bering Strait, you will find loads of travels happened there, which created or which gave America a specific importance in dealing with the other sort of the Arctic areas. That is why the sea is important.
Okay, so we have another question from Nabonita Haldar.
Can you hear me?
The difference between... Yes, absolutely, clearly.
What is different between American and English literature? This is a wonderful question which can take days to answer. The most important difference would be, remember, English literature is more crown-centered and American literature is more man-centered. In England, there is a famous proverb. They have to take care of two Ks, the king and the cricket. In America, it is mostly man in different circumstances. So the importance given to man is more important is more sort of pronounced in American literature. That is the most important difference.
Okay, and I don't think there are more questions, but there are plenty of comments, plenty of them. So lots of them actually. So, we are with them in these comments. It was an absolutely fabulous lecture. And at this moment, since there are no more questions, I would request Piyali once again to deliver the formal vote of thanks. And thank you, Chaitali, from my side too. Over to Piyali.
So we conclude our program today with this formal vote of thanks. Our heartfelt thanks to our honorable speaker, Professor Maitra, for her lucid discussion. We have gained a lot intellectually, and our students have also been enlightened a lot. And I think she has eased the task of all the teachers to explain American literature in class. So thank you, Professor Maitra. Thanks and gratitude is also expressed to our Honorable President, Sri Joydev Haldar, for being our mentor and constant support. We sincerely thank our Principal, Dr. A.J. Hassan, for his constant encouragement. Thanks to all our GB members for motivating and guiding us. Sincere thanks to our bursar and presently acting teacher in charge, Dr. Taposh Kumar Paul, for always being with us in every program. Special thanks to our IQAC coordinator, Professor Ranjini Guho, for her untiring and unending efforts. Our college colleagues are also to be thanked. Thanking our head of the department, Professor Anupama Maitra, for arranging and coordinating the whole event. Thanks also due to her for her technical support. And for this technical support, I would also like to thank our teacher in the computer science department, Sri Shamuresh Pramanik. Thanks to all our departmental colleagues because they have been our constant support. And also wholehearted thanks to all our participants across the globe. They have been our backbone. Thanks to our dear students for whom we always feel motivated. So thank you all for your support and helping this event to take place. Thank you.